Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope that everyone is still feeling fairly awake after their lunch, but I guess it's my job to wake you up if you're feeling a little bit sleepy. So, yeah, I mean, as was just kind of introed, I'm not sure how many Formula One fans we have in the room. Quick show of hands. Actually, that might be the most enthusiastic response I've had to that. So those that are Formula One fans will be aware of some of this background. For those that aren't, you probably may still associate the sport with a man called Bernie Ecclestone, who ran it probably largely single-handed for, I think, the best part of 40 years in the end. Back in 2017, Formula One was bought by Liberty Media.
Thank you.
And then I joined the company, the research team was created, and I joined the company in early 2017. The situation we inherited was essentially this one on screen now. There was basically one stakeholder who was known on the reports as Mr. E. You can probably guess that was Bernie Ecclestone himself. And basically there were only two research reports. One was a kind of sponsorship exposure report, and one was kind of a fairly basic TV audiences report. And apart from that, there was no research going on in the company. Clearly that was kind of felt to be a pretty gaping hole in what was required. So we've kind of over the last 2.5 years, we've tried to move on to this situation. We kind of picked the number 100 there as our number of stakeholders. We kind of plucked that out of thin air. The point is we have lots of stakeholders now, basically. And we're covering, the stakeholders are not just internal either, they're also external. You know, we have a direct relationship with the constructors, with the circuits that run our races, and numerous other stakeholders in the sport. And we're trying to cover a whole raft of areas. So, just to cover some of them here, we're focusing obviously particularly on who our fans are. So we've done a number of studies in this area. One of the first things we did was a big qualitative brand study. We do kind of the brand tracking and audience segmentation that I think you would expect kind of most big companies to do. Our fan voice community is an online community of about 60,000 F1 fans that we use for surveys. There are forums on there, people write blogs, it gives us a feel for what people are thinking about the sport. We're developing our CRM database. In terms of how people consume F1, we've kind of really upped our social media presence, and we're trying to do a lot more in terms of what and how people use social media around the sport. We produce our own TV coverage that goes out to all our broadcasters, so we do a lot of work into the perceptions of that coverage and how we can improve that. And then this section, what they are experiencing, this is more what we're going to talk about today. And this is how people experience the sport at the circuits, at a race. So we have post-race surveys that go out for about 16 of our 21 races a year. And then the main thing relevant for today is the on-site footfall tracking, which just allows us to get a feel for how people move around a circuit, how they actually spend their day. You know, in F1, attending an F1 race is not like another sport where you're enclosed. Most other sports you're enclosed in a stadium. Here you've got kind of many square kilometres that you could potentially roam around if you wanted to. So it's quite a difficult environment to understand. And linked to that is how people can engage with our sponsors while they're at the circuit. Our sponsors have kind of fairly significant presence at most of our circuits, particularly in the fan zone, where they all have their own activations that fans can engage with. And that they were areas that in the old days we just had no understanding of. We signed a contract for a circuit to run a race. The circuit went away and did it, and we didn't take much to do with it. There's now kind of an understanding that it's mutually beneficial for us to kind of increase our understanding. We can help them create the best experience they possibly can. Works for them, works for us. So the project we're going to talk about today is this kind of Wi-Fi technology that allows us to kind of understand how people are moving around a racetrack, what's working well, what we can improve, and how we can basically give people the best possible experience when they attend a race. So we run this with a company called Mesh, who supply these sensors. We first ran this project at the US Grand Prix late in 2017. We're running it at about half of our races this year, and we'll run it at about half of our races again next year. The number of sensors we use at a circuit varies slightly, but it tends to be 60-odd sensors. And the technology, as I said, it basically allows us to track how people move around the circuit, where gets busy, where people spend a long time, where they kind of first go when they arrive, all this kind of stuff. From a commercial point of view, I think some of the key things are kind of how many people are visiting merchandise stores and how long do they spend there, what are the queues like there. I talked about fan activations a little bit earlier, but essentially it's not just about purely the fan experience, because obviously there's a commercial benefit. If the fan enjoys their experience more, they're more likely to spend money there, they're more likely to come back in the future, and so on. So how does it work? So these they basically pick up the Wi-Fi pings from people's mobile phones. So if you have Wi-Fi switched on your mobile, you don't have to be connected to a network, but it will kind of be sending a ping out looking for a Wi-Fi connection, and these sensors pick these up. And then you can tell how much I understand the technical side of this by the fact that we've got the phrase special algorithms on the next bullet point. Essentially, they can measure the kind of signal strength, and it can tell how far away you are from the sensor, roughly in what direction, and how long you spend in that position. Lots of different metrics and KPIs that we can use from that, but essentially the kind of main ones are the reach of the different sensors, and whatever we've placed that sensor on, the distance from it, and how long people spend in that position. And yeah, the last point, an important one in the research world, I guess, although a bit boring, is that it's all GDPR compliant. The technology, obviously the devices have a kind of device ID, but the technology scrambles that ID as soon as it picks them up. So there's never any way of actually actually relating it back to a particular individual. This is roughly what the sensor looks like. You can't get much of a feel for size from that, but it's kind of 15 centimeters by 15 or something like that. So it's a pretty small sensor. It's battery powered, so you can charge it up overnight, and it should last through the whole of the next day. Although it's picking up Wi-Fi signals, it doesn't need a Wi-Fi signal itself to do that, if you see what I mean. So you can use it basically anywhere. We've put 30 meter radius on there. It's kind of sensitive to the environment, so 30 meters is about average, but it can actually go further if you've got it in a particularly open space with not much surrounding it. One kind of word of warning if you ever come to use this technology is that you do have to make sure the security team at the venue are aware of these things, because we have had a few get removed at certain races as suspicious devices. So definitely make sure you know that you let people know that you're putting them up in advance. The other thing to mention, just on the technology side of it, is there is a real-time dashboard that you can use with this technology. It's actually not something that we particularly use at Formula One, basically because we don't really have the resource to kind of track what's going on and quickly react to it in a live environment. But that is something you can do with it if it's something that probably if you're in a more contained environment and you have that resource, there is a live dashboard that you can use as well. So that's kind of a little bit about the background and how this the project and the technology works. What we're going to do for the rest of the session is give you kind of some of the highlights that we've had from it, some of the ways we use it, some of the things we've done off the back of it. Some of these slides are a little bit rough and ready. I apologise for that. This is quite a kind of data-heavy slide. This is kind of a selection of the races that we used the technology at in 2018. So Bahrain, Spain, Azerbaijan, Canada, France, Britain, and Belgium, and some of the main metrics. So unique visitors, the sensors pick up about, we think, between 70 and 80% of all the people at the circuit. Some people don't have mobile devices with them, so young children, or being stereotypical, maybe pensioners that attend the race. Some people have the Wi-Fi switched off. Occasionally it just doesn't quite pick people up properly. So it's not kind of a perfect guide to attendance, but what it definitely does do is it gives you a massive sample size to base people's behaviours on. A couple of things on this slide, a couple of things that we learned from the data on this slide. So average days per visitor, this was interesting to us because a lot of people buy a 3-day ticket for a Grand Prix, and yet the average is generally around 1.2, 1.3 days that people attend. So there's quite a lot of people. What we've kind of learned from that through further research is that there's a lot of people that buy a 3-day ticket but don't go, probably on the Friday when it's just practice sessions and nothing competitive going on. There's also quite a lot of people that buy a 3-day ticket and then share it with people. So even though it's one ticket, we get 2, potentially 3 people going to a race on that ticket. The other interesting thing is the daily time spent at the circuit. We definitely see that we've got different types of circuits here. We've got generally city centre circuits like Azerbaijan, for instance, even Montreal in Canada to some extent, where because you're near the city centre, people are spending less time at the circuit. There's lots of stuff for them to do outside of the circuit, but close to the circuit, if you see what I mean. So they tend to spend a lot of time in city centres, come to the circuit for a shorter period of time, go back to the city centre. If you take somewhere like Belgium, you're in the middle of a forest, miles away from anywhere, the average time spent per day there is more like 4 hours, and you'd even find a fairly significant number of people spending 6 hours plus at the circuit on any given day. I'm going to show you an example of some analysis from this is from the first race we conducted this at, so the US Grand Prix in 2017. What we're looking here is people's arrival time at the circuit on the Saturday. So kind of initially it's kind of as you would expect, it's kind of relatively small numbers early in the morning, growing up towards sort of 10, 11 o'clock. The qualifying session is the main event on a Saturday. That was, I think, about 2 o'clock local time. So you can see as you get to 2 o'clock, the arrivals are evening off. Then there's a big peak at 5 o'clock, which might seem a bit strange. All the racing is over by 5 o'clock, but that's when the most people arrive. And that's actually because the US Grand Prix run concerts on the Saturday evening, but they run concerts that are targeted at a very different audience to the F1 audience. So this was a Justin Timberlake concert in 2017. And as you can see, there's clearly quite a lot of people that wanted to come for the Justin Timberlake concert and didn't want to come for the Formula One. So we could obviously make an effort to get all the Justin Timberlake fans into F1. We might convert a few, but it's probably not the easiest thing to do. They're not the most realistic target audience in general. So kind of one of our learnings from this is probably actually, well, maybe we can tap into to the music audience, to the Justin Timberlake audience, and actually why don't some of our merchandise stands carry stuff that's targeted at those people as well? And so there's kind of an extra commercial opportunity potentially there. Next example, so this is from the Spanish Grand Prix last year in 2018. What we found is that essentially half of the people arriving at the circuit were coming through 2 particular gates, gates 6 and 7. 6 and 7 obviously means nothing to you, but they're very busy gates at the Spanish Grand Prix. The picture kind of at the top left there is essentially the merchandise offering that you walk past from one of those gates as you make your way kind of towards the main areas, so the grandstand and the fan zone and so on. So there's kind of one small merchandise stand that kind of gets busy very quickly. Essentially, the finding is that, you know, we're not exposing people to merchandise enough. There's a lot of people coming in through these gates, and they're kind of all flooding past this tiny little merchandise stall. Then they're probably finding their grandstand or finding somewhere to kind of set up camp for the day, and then they're then not really going around looking for things that much. So this year in Spain, we kind of worked with the promoter to make sure that some of these heavier footfall areas had more in terms of a merchandise offering, more in terms of a food and beverage offering, again, just so that we can kind of maximise the commercial potential a little bit. Next example is from the Australian Grand Prix, which is the Australian Grand Prix this year, first race of the season. And this is kind of fairly, the next couple of slides are fairly typical of a lot of our circuits. What we often do is we'll kind of split up the circuit into rough geographic zones and then look at how many of the visits, how many of the kind of pings that we pick up come from each zone. So you can see in Australia, the south zone has the highest proportion, over a third of them. That's kind of where some of the busier entrances are. It's where the fan zone is. It's where a lot of the kind of entertainment options at the circuit are. All of the other zones are kind of quite a long way behind in terms of the number of visits. So north and east particular are kind of half the number of visits to the south zone. Our designers spent hours putting this slide together, so I hope you like it. But to kind of take this a little bit further, in terms of the number of geographic zones that people visit, 3/4 of people only visit one of those geographic zones. So essentially, I kind of touched on this on one of the earlier examples, but essentially people kind of come in and they explore a little bit. They might go and look for their grandstand, they might go and look for the fan zone, but once they're in, they don't move around that much. They don't kind of explore everything that is available. So I think the big learning for us is to kind of get to the bottom, and we try to do this by coupling these findings with our post-race surveys. Get to the bottom of why people aren't moving around. Is it because they're not interested in the stuff that is elsewhere, or is it because they don't know about the stuff that's elsewhere? And for a lot of people, what we found is that it's a lack of awareness. They don't know where the fan zone is, or they don't know what's in the fan zone, so they might see that there is one, but not think it's worth going there. So there's definitely more that we can do in terms of pre-race information, and then in terms of signage and information at the circuit, and then a certain proportion. Some people will want to go and just sit in the same place all day, and that's fine, but there's definitely a significant proportion of that 77% that would move around more if they felt they had a reason to move. Another example based on merchandise, this is from the Bahrain Grand Prix earlier this year. Essentially what we're saying here is, linked to the Spanish Grand Prix example earlier, a lot of people don't get exposed to the merchandise stalls when they're at a race. So on the left-hand side, you can see there that a bit more than half of the visitors at the Bahrain Grand Prix weren't picked up near a merchandise stall. Partly it comes down to this idea of information. It's often kind of not very well signposted what there is around the circuit. If you see one of those small merchandise stalls that we had a picture of earlier, you often wouldn't necessarily assume that there's bigger merchandise stalls somewhere else. But there are at all of our races. There's kind of a big merchandise area and then smaller satellite stores all over the place. So you might see one of the smaller ones and assume that that's the whole range and not go looking for anything else, or you might just not know that somewhere near the fan zone there'll be a big one. So yeah, more than half the people don't go to any merchandise stores. Of them, even a significant proportion are only picked up at the satellite ones. So again, lots more we can do to point people in the right direction. This is from the French Grand Prix last year. The French Grand Prix is this weekend. If anyone wants to tune in for that, don't miss it. So a similar kind of theme basically around people not moving around the circuit. The way the French circuit is kind of laid out, it's actually quite a narrow circuit. You kind of, broadly speaking, there's a long straight with a few chicanes, and then you go round, and then there's a long straight with a chicane, and then you go round again. So it's quite narrow, and you come in from one side of the circuit. Most of the gates anyway are on one side of the circuit at the top, and the fan zone, for instance, is at the bottom of the circuit. But there's not very far for you to go to get to the fan zone. You can see here that after coming in, only 6% of people then went to the fan zone. The vast majority of people went to their seats because that is the nearest thing to them. But as I say, it wasn't far to get to the fan zone. So I think people didn't know where it was, didn't know that there was a reason to go there. The grandstands had kind of small food and beverage areas and small merchandise units around them. So people just didn't necessarily know that they could go and get a better experience at another part of the circuit, and there'd be more entertainment options. And they kind of chose instead to stay around their seats for on average, I think it was 3 or 4 hours that people were spending around the grandstands. Here's an example kind of more specific to the fan zone. So the fan zone is where we have a lot of these entertainment options that I'm talking about. A lot of these would also be assigned to one of our sponsors. So the Pit Stop Challenge, for instance, is associated with Pirelli. So it's kind of important for our sponsors that we get as many people there and get as many people engaged with these things as possible. What we're looking at here is the red bar is everyone kind of within reach of a sensor. Then the yellow bar is essentially people getting within 15 meters of that activation, and the black bar is people getting within 5 meters and staying there for at least 30 seconds, and we kind of, for the purposes of this analysis, counting that as an engaged user. So the conversion rates you can see along the line are essentially the engaged users divided by the sum of engaged and passers-by. So if you get if you get near enough to see what it is, how many people are then actually kind of going and spending time, whether that's watching what's going on or actually taking part in it. And it's interesting that you get quite a big variation in conversion rates. So in this example, the reaction challenge, that's kind of a thing where lights come on and you have to jump up and hit the lights. That had a very high conversion rate, whereas something like the TV challenge, that's where you do your own F1 news report, and the Pit Stop Challenge had much lower conversion. So from our kind of experience of being at the races, we can then sort of put together the reasons for that. So sometimes it might be queues, for instance, that people see an activation with a massive queue and they don't want to go and kind of lose their time waiting to take part in it. They can't get near enough because of the queue to see what's going on, so they kind of move on elsewhere. We've also had races where it's kind of been to do with the placement. So occasionally we've had an activation where the back of the structure essentially was kind of next to the main thoroughfare. So people were getting picked up by the sensor, but actually they couldn't really see what was happening in that structure. So that was just a case of bad placement. And so when we kind of put these figures together with the geography of the fan zone, we can work out how to best lay things out for the next year. So what have we done as a result? To be honest, I've kind of touched on a lot of these things already, but related to the information and the signage, we've now launched an F1 event app. So at every Grand Prix, you can download an app that will give you information specific to that race. The merchandise strategy I've kind of talked about quite a lot. Changing locations of fan activations. Fan forum schedules, haven't really talked about that. Essentially, we have a stage in the fan zone, and events will take place on the stage, and we'll have guests such as F1 drivers. One of the issues we found was that there was often high footfall around the stage, but not when we had special guests on the stage. So again, it's just an information thing about trying to kind of let people know when the interesting things are going to be on, and also trying to tailor the schedule to what people's natural movements are. And plans for 2019 and beyond. So as I said earlier on, we're going to use this technology at roughly half our races this year and next year, so that would be roughly 20 races in all. We've been looking at things like doing facial coding analysis in grandstands to see how people react to the race as well, to add that element of people's experience to it. It's kind of difficult GDPR-wise, and we're still trying to kind of work through that, but that's something that we could potentially do in the future. And I think these key areas for investigation are, again, things that I've kind of touched on quite a lot already. So sorry, went a bit early with the clicker there. Just to finish, we've got kind of a 2-minute video. This is based on the first project we did at the 2017 US Grand Prix. And it just will give you a little bit more detail about some of the findings we have from that race and the kind of detail we can get from this project for an individual event. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you very much.
That was great, Greg. Thank you very much. Anyone want to ask some questions around that? Wow. You ready? We might need someone to catch it in the middle.
Wow.
Sorry. Yeah, now you saw my sports skills now. Thank you very much for the presentation, first of all. It was very energizing, although after lunchtime we were all a bit tired. I wanted to ask you a bit more about your next steps. We at JTI use something similar at events, at festivals, usually to see how festival participants are moving around the area. And we're also looking into facial recognition. So I was wondering if you can share with us some more thoughts on how you see this integration between mesh and facial recognition.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess it essentially links into in theory, to the section of the experience where people are in their grandstand seats. I think it's so in a way they're kind of in a way I think they're not kind of directly integrated. It's almost more that we think how people kind of experience watching the race and watching our support races and everything that happens on the track is kind of an element of the experience that we don't quite cover, because from Mesh it's great that we can cover how people move around the circuit, and in a lot of areas, so you know, in our fan zone, I think at most races we find that people spend sort of half an hour roughly in the fan zone. In a grandstand it's kind of different, because there are some people, that French Grand Prix example, I think it was something like 3.5 hours on average that people were sitting in a grandstand. So kind of the issue is, for us, is probably more that we have this 3.5 hour section where we know people are in the grandstand, but we don't really know if they're enjoying it. We don't know, you know, they're probably watching a race and at least one support race or event when they're there. We don't know kind of how carefully they're watching it, whether they're enjoying it, what their view is like, and all this kind of thing. So I think it's, for us, it's probably that facial coding element is, or that part of the day in the grandstand is like a large amount of time. And when people aren't moving around, then we kind of don't know as much about their experience. So it's kind of covering a gap, essentially.
Yeah, and one more question. How do you see the consumer reaction to that? I assume all the data is normalized, so you can't track back people based on face features. But I, for example, already see it as a bit disturbing. How would you tackle this challenge if it comes when you implement the new?
Yeah, so in relation to the sensor technology specifically. So yeah, that's an interesting one. So we take the advice of our legal team, essentially, and the advice of the legal team is that because nothing is personally identifiable, and we can't trace it back to any individuals. We can't trace it back to a ticket buyer. We have like literally no idea who the people are. It's just a device moving around. So the advice from our legal team is that makes it GDPR compliant. And you know, we don't advertise heavily that this is taking place at the races. With the facial coding, that's different, because we would have to tell people that they are being filmed, essentially. So the facial coding is kind of, I think we've got it in there as like a potential, something that we would like to do, but at the moment we're not in a position to do it because we don't quite know how we would handle that, and that is clearly a sensitive area. We would probably have to recruit a sample of people who are at the race and give them their own area of a circuit, but that may create issues for the promoter that's selling the tickets. So there's kind of a network of issues, I guess, to get through before we can actually go ahead and do that.
We'll have to finish up there, Greg.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Greg's around for questions as well.
Thank you.